The year was 1945. The spring air in Germany carried neither warmth nor hope, only the smoke of what had once been cities and dreams. The war was ending, or so the radio said, but for most, there was little difference between peace and defeat. Villages that had survived the bombings were ghostly with silence, their windows blown out, their streets stripped bare by hunger. In one such village, on the outskirts of Fulda, a woman named Anna Muller walked through the ruins of her own house with the grace of someone who had already stopped expecting miracles. Her hands were raw from lifting bricks and splintered wood. Her husband's uniform lay buried somewhere under the debris. She hadn't had the strength to dig for it. The only thing she had saved was a small wooden crucifix, burned on one side, its edges still blackened. Every morning, she set it by the broken window and whispered a prayer for the dead. First for her husband, then for her child, and finally for herself. She never said the words out loud. The silence seemed more respectful. Anna had been a teacher before the war, the kind who believed books could make better men. But those men had gone to war, and the books had been burned. Now, in her 30s, she looked twice her age, her body starved thin beneath a threadbare gray coat. Her world had narrowed to the same daily question. How long could she survive on ration scraps and melted snow? The day the Americans arrived, she was scavenging firewood behind the old chapel. The sky was low and gray, the kind that made shadows disappear. She heard the rumble first, jeeps grinding over gravel roads, the sharp click of boots, the foreign sound of laughter. The enemy had come, but the word enemy had long since lost its shape. Anna didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. A patrol of 5 men entered the square, rifles slung over their shoulders, helmets shining wet with drizzle. They spoke in clipped English, their voices tired but alert. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw and eyes that carried the weight of too many orders, stopped when he saw her. Sergeant James Carter, 27, from a small town in Ohio that hadn't seen a bomb in its life. To him, she looked less like a German and more like a ghost. "Ma'am?" he said, the word careful, almost hesitant. He didn't expect an answer. Anna froze, clutching the bundle of wood against her chest. She didn't understand his words, but she recognized the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. Just human. That frightened her more than the rifles did. She turned and fled through the back of the chapel, the sound of her boots echoing against the stone like shots. Carter watched her go. Behind him, one of his men muttered, "Leave her, Sarge. They're all the same, scared or lying." But he didn't move. Something about her, perhaps the way her eyes darted like a wounded animal's, or the silent dignity in her posture, held him in place. He'd seen the arrogance of generals and the madness of fanatics, but he'd never seen despair look so composed. He lowered his rifle and walked toward the chapel. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and candle smoke. The altar had been reduced to rubble, but the smell of wax lingered. Anna was there, kneeling near a cracked statue of the Virgin, whispering to no one. Carter hesitated at the door, unsure whether to interrupt. He could hear the distant pop of gunfire, isolated resistance, or maybe just nerves on the front line. The war hadn't fully stopped breathing yet. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on broken glass. Anna flinched. When she turned, her face was pale, streaked with soot, her eyes glassy from exhaustion. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, 2 survivors from opposite sides of a catastrophe neither had started. Carter reached into his pack and pulled out a tin of water and half a ration biscuit. He placed them on the stone floor and stepped back, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Drink," he said softly, motioning with his chin. Anna didn't move. She didn't trust kindness. Kindness had vanished years ago, but thirst was stronger than pride. Slowly, she took the tin, sipping as if afraid it might vanish. The water tasted of metal and dust, but to her, it was sacred. Carter watched her with an expression she couldn't name. Pity? No, something quieter, deeper. He saw in her what he'd seen in every shattered town they passed through. People who weren't enemies, just leftovers of someone else's war. Outside, the other soldiers called for him. "Sarge, we're moving on." He gave a short nod toward the woman and turned to leave. But before stepping out, he looked back. She was standing now, the tin pressed against her chest, eyes lowered, lips trembling with words she didn't know how to say. "Danke," she whispered finally, her voice cracked but sincere. He didn't understand the word, but he understood its weight. He gave a small smile, one of the few he'd managed in months, and disappeared into the gray light. That night, Anna sat by the window, staring at the horizon. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the hush of wind through ruins. For the first time since the bombing, she felt something that almost resembled warmth. Not hope, just the faint awareness that she wasn't invisible. Days passed. The Americans stayed longer than expected, setting up a small command post nearby. Anna watched them from afar, careful not to be seen. They handed out supplies to starving villagers, repaired wells, even helped bury the dead. Yet she noticed how the locals avoided them, pride and shame intertwining like barbed wire. To ask for help was to admit defeat. Carter, meanwhile, found his thoughts returning to the woman in the chapel. He didn't tell his men. Soldiers weren't supposed to feel compassion for the conquered. But in quiet moments, between patrols and paperwork, he caught himself wondering if she'd survived the cold nights. He had lost his brother in France, seen children digging through trash for bread, and buried too many bodies to believe in fate. But something about that meeting gnawed at him. On the 5th day, he returned to the chapel alone. The roof leaked, sunlight dripping through in dusty columns. She wasn't there. He turned to leave, but then saw movement behind the altar. Anna emerged, her coat torn, a cut on her cheek. When she saw him, she froze again, but only for a heartbeat. Then slowly she stepped forward. He lifted his hand in greeting. "It's okay," he said. "No harm." She nodded, understanding the tone if not the words. He reached into his jacket and handed her another ration tin, this time filled with soup, lukewarm but rich with the smell of meat. Her eyes widened. She hesitated, then took it. "Warm?" she asked quietly. "Why?" Carter didn't answer. He couldn't. He just gave a half-smile that said enough. The sound of a church bell echoed from somewhere down the valley. An old bell rung not for worship but for surrender. The war officially was over. But the silence it left behind was heavier than any gunfire. Anna sat on the chapel step, eating slowly, her hands shaking from both hunger and disbelief. Carter stood nearby, watching the smoke drift from a distant farmhouse. For the first time since the invasion, the air smelled not of blood but of wet earth. When she finished, she set the tin down carefully, like something sacred. Their eyes met again, two strangers united by a shared absence. He gestured toward her house. "Home?" he asked. She shook her head. "Gone." He nodded, jaw tight, understanding too well. There was nothing more to say. He started to turn away, but she stopped him with a single word. "Glebe," she whispered. "Stay." He didn't understand, but he felt it. The sound of that one word carried a weight far heavier than the rifles he'd carried through France and Germany combined. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the radio on his belt crackled. Orders to regroup. The war may have ended, but duty hadn't. Carter gave her a final look, something between apology and promise. Then he walked back into the fog, leaving her standing alone in the doorway of the broken chapel, the crucifix still flickering faintly beside her. As his silhouette vanished into the mist, Anna whispered the words she wished he could understand. "You should not have helped me." Her voice trembled, not from fear but from the faint, dangerous spark of feeling she thought had died long ago. Because deep down, she knew, acts of kindness in times like these never ended quietly. They began wars of their own. The war had ended, but hunger was the truer victor. It prowled through every German town, invisible and merciless, claiming what bullets had spared. By summer of 1945, the fields were ashes, the trains gone silent, and the air thick with the smell of decay and dust. People no longer spoke of tomorrow, they spoke of food. Anna Muller, who once taught children to read Goethe and Schiller, now searched the forest floor for anything that could burn or boil. She had stopped counting days. The Americans had settled near Fulda, their camp pitched where the wheat fields used to sway. They were not cruel, only distant. Their voices carried across the ruined village, English words heavy with laughter, command, and boredom. Anna avoided them, but she could not escape the sound of their world. It was alive while hers was a graveyard. Every dawn she walked to the edge of town, where an old well still trickled muddy water. There she saw them, the foreign soldiers with clean uniforms and bright tins of food. She kept her distance, head bowed, pretending not to stare at the steaming cans they opened, the bread they tore with careless hands. Once, when the wind shifted, the scent of coffee reached her. She wept right there, quietly, because she hadn't smelled coffee in 2 years. One morning, as she filled her cracked pail, she saw him again, the tall soldier with the steady eyes. Sergeant James Carter. He stood by a jeep, checking his rifle, the sunlight cutting sharp lines across his face. When he noticed her, he didn't move for a moment, as if weighing the memory of that meeting in the chapel. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand. Not a salute, not quite a wave, something in between, a gesture stripped of rank. Anna froze, unsure if she should acknowledge him. The villagers had warned her, "Don't talk to them. They can do what they want." But hunger is its own commander. That night, she dreamed of bread, thick slices, soft and steaming, the way her mother used to bake before the war. 3 days later, as she returned from scavenging roots, she found something on her doorstep, a small paper bag. Inside was half a loaf of army bread and a tin of beans. No note, no mark, just food. She stared at it for a long time before daring to eat, afraid it might be a trick. When the first bite touched her tongue, she nearly sobbed. The taste was foreign, too salty, too processed, but it was salvation. That night, she lit a candle for the first time in months. She didn't pray. She only whispered to the flame, "Thank you," though she didn't know to whom. The next morning, he was there again. Carter, standing by the road with a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then offered a faint nod. He returned it with a slight smile and walked away. No words passed. None were needed. In the weeks that followed, this silent exchange grew into a fragile rhythm. He would leave small things, a tin, a bar of soap, once even a comb, and she would leave something in return. A wildflower, a hand-sewn kerchief, once a small wooden cross carved from her ruined home. Each offering was a sentence in a language neither fully spoke. Rules forbade it. Carter knew that. Fraternization with locals could mean suspension, even court-martial. But he couldn't stop. Every delivery felt less like pity and more like defiance. His men joked that he was playing priest, saving German souls, but he ignored them. He had seen too much cruelty disguised as duty. He wanted to believe mercy could survive orders. One evening, after patrol, he found her near the chapel again. She was gathering kindling when he approached. She didn't run this time. "Anna," he said softly, trying her name. She looked startled but didn't correct him. He pointed at the bundle of sticks, then at her hands, cut and swollen. He knelt, taking one from her arms, and stacked it beside her. She frowned in confusion, then realized what he was doing. "Helping." "Danke," she murmured. "Don't mention it," he replied, though she wouldn't understand. They worked in silence until dusk fell. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the wind gentle, the distant hum of Allied trucks fading into the hills. For a brief, impossible moment, there were no sides, no uniforms, just two people trying to rebuild warmth. Later that night, he returned to camp and found his superior waiting. Lieutenant Harrison, sharp-eyed and skeptical. "You've been wandering off a lot, Carter," Harrison said. "Don't tell me you're feeding the locals." Carter hesitated. "Sir, they're starving. Some haven't eaten in days. That's not our concern. Orders are clear. No contact. You start playing saint, and they'll start expecting miracles. We're not here for that." Carter said nothing. The reprimand stung, not because of the tone, but because he knew the man was right. By military law, compassion was a liability. But laws written in comfort rarely survived the test of hunger. The next day, Carter still went back. He brought soup hot from the field kitchen. Anna was waiting by the chapel door, as if she had sensed he'd come. She looked thinner than before, her cheeks hollowed by exhaustion. When he handed her the tin, she shook her head. "Neen," she said softly. "Too much." He frowned. "Eat." She hesitated, then took the tin, holding it carefully in both hands. She dipped a spoon, tasted, and closed her eyes as warmth spread through her chest. For a few minutes, she ate in silence, and he just watched, the way her trembling fingers steadied, the way a faint color returned to her face. "Good?" he asked. She opened her eyes and nodded. "Gut." He smiled, repeating it under his breath. "Good," then pointed to his chest. "James." "Yes," she repeated, stumbling over the syllables. Then, touching her chest, she said, "Anna." He nodded. "Anna." The moment was small, almost absurd in its simplicity, yet it felt monumental. In a world divided by death and flags, two names had bridged an ocean. As days turned into weeks, that fragile bridge became their refuge. He taught her simple English words: bread, water, friend. She repeated them slowly, her accent soft and careful. In return, she taught him hunger, Hoffnung, and Danke, hope. Hunger, thanks. Sometimes, when the camp radio played faint jazz from the American station, she would listen from afar, the music drifting over the fields like a memory of peace. Once, Carter caught her smiling to the tune. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. But compassion in occupied land was never invisible. Whispers began. Villagers saw her with him, soldiers joked behind his back. "Carter's got himself a German sweetheart," they laughed. It wasn't true, not in the way they meant, but rumors had a way of killing truths gentler than love. One evening, Carter arrived later than usual. She was waiting, worried. When she saw him, relief washed over her face, then turned to alarm when she noticed the bruise on his cheek. He waved it off. "Nothing. Just talk." She touched her lips, unsure of how to respond, then pressed her palm lightly against his sleeve, a gesture of wordless gratitude. The contact lasted a second, maybe less, but it lingered like a confession neither dared voice. Behind them, thunder rolled. A storm was coming, both on the horizon and within their fragile world. Carter knew the watch patrols were tightening. Harrison had already warned him once more. "One mistake," he'd said coldly, "and you'll answer for it." That night, rain fell heavy on the chapel roof. Anna sat by the window, clutching the empty tin he'd given her, the faint scent of soup still clinging to it. Outside, she could hear distant laughter from the American camp. So close, yet belonging to another world. She whispered his name once, quietly, as if the night might carry it to him. In the camp, Carter lay awake under canvas, staring at the ceiling while thunder cracked overhead. He could still see her face, the way she said Hoffnung as though the word itself were fragile. He knew he couldn't stop going back. Not now. Not after he'd seen what mercy looked like in her eyes. But even mercy has borders, and soon, someone would decide he'd crossed them. The rain had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. The fields around Fulda glistened under a pale dawn, but the mud held the footprints of soldiers, boots sinking deep into the wounded earth. The war was officially over, yet for Sergeant James Carter, peace felt like a rumor that hadn't reached this far. His orders were simple: maintain discipline, secure the zone, and keep distance from civilians. But in war, the simplest orders often demanded the hardest obedience. For weeks he had broken that rule quietly, methodically. A ration tin here, a loaf there, a few kind words across a language barrier that had somehow grown thinner each day. To his men, it looked like charity. To his superiors, it would look like betrayal. But to him, it was survival of another kind, the survival of decency. Still, every act of mercy left a trace. And in a place built on suspicion, traces were dangerous. It began with a whisper, Private Mason, the youngest in Carter's unit, noticed the missing rations first. "Sir," he muttered one night by the fire, "someone's been dipping into supply crates. Bread, beans, soap too." He said it casually, as if reading a weather report, but his eyes flicked to Carter's pack. Carter didn't flinch. He'd learned that soldiers could smell guilt faster than gunpowder. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice flat. Mason nodded, though the unease in his expression lingered. Later, Carter burned the empty wrappers behind the camp latrine, the smoke rising like a confession. That same evening, he went back to the village under the pretense of scouting. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and wet soil. He found Anna outside the chapel, mending what was left of a curtain. She looked different now, still frail but steadier, as if survival had become a skill she was learning to master. When she saw him, she smiled in that hesitant way of hers, a smile that seemed borrowed from an older, gentler life. He handed her a cloth bundle. Inside were potatoes, salt, and a small tin of coffee, the last from his personal supply. Her eyes widened, disbelief flickering across her face. She whispered something in German, too fast for him to catch, then caught herself and said slowly, "Too much." "Not enough," he answered, his tone firm but kind. They sat for a while beneath the chapel window, sharing the quiet. The world around them was unrecognizable, half rebuilt, half grieving. She asked, in broken English, "Why help me?" He thought about it, then shrugged. "Because someone should." Her gaze softened. "Good man," she said. He almost laughed, though the sound came out weary. "No," he replied. "Just tired of being the other kind." The moment should have ended there, brief and harmless. But war leaves no kindness unnoticed. When Carter returned to camp, Lieutenant Harrison was waiting by the command tent, arms folded, eyes sharp enough to slice through the night. "Sergeant," Harrison said evenly, "you've been taking long walks for a man with short orders." Carter stopped. "Just checking perimeter, sir." Harrison's tone didn't change. "Perimeter doesn't run through villages. Last I checked." A pause stretched between them, taut and electric. The other soldiers pretended not to listen, but their silence was an audience. Harrison stepped closer. "Let me make this plain. Fraternization with civilians, especially German civilians, is against regulation. You want to throw your career away feeding the enemy. That's your business. But I won't have it on my record." "She's not the enemy," Carter said quietly. "The war's over." Harrison's jaw twitched. "The ink on the treaty doesn't erase what happened. Keep your sympathy to yourself." He turned, then added without looking back, "And if I catch you again, you'll be on the next convoy home in handcuffs." Carter stood there, fists clenched, the night pressing hard against his ribs. He had followed orders all his life, but this sterile command to be indifferent, felt impossible. The next day, he didn't go to the village. He stayed in camp, forcing himself into duty, inspecting weapons, logging rations, pretending not to hear his conscience. But silence, he found, was a poor substitute for peace. Every clatter of a mess tin reminded him of the sound of her gratitude. Every waft of coffee reminded him of the tin he'd given her. On the third day, he gave in. The road to the chapel was slick with mud, but he didn't care. When he arrived, she was there as if waiting for him, her face pale in the mist. "You come back," she said softly. "Shouldn't have," he replied, but the words lacked conviction. She frowned. "Bad?" He nodded. "Could be." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Then no more. You stop." The simplicity of it struck him. She was trying to protect him, even as she clutched the bundle of food he'd given her days before. He wanted to tell her that kindness shouldn't need permission, that the world needed rebuilding from its smallest corners. But he didn't have the words, not in English, not in German. So instead, he said, "I'll be careful." Her eyes searched his face, reading what language could not. Then she nodded, resigned, and turned away. That night, Carter's name appeared in a report. Someone, Mason perhaps, or one of the older soldiers, had mentioned the missing rations again. The suspicion reached Harrison's desk by morning. By noon, Carter was summoned. Inside the tent, Harrison stood behind a wooden table cluttered with papers. "Sit down," he said coldly. "You've been busy feeding ghosts, Sergeant." Carter didn't move. "You have proof. Enough to ruin you." Harrison picked up a crumpled note. One of the ration slips, smudged with dirt. "This yours?" Carter stared at it. It wasn't, but denial felt pointless. "Yes," he said finally. Harrison sighed, almost disappointed. "You could have had a clean record. You've served well. But sentiment has no place in uniform." Carter's reply came steady, low. "If it doesn't, maybe the uniform needs changing." Harrison's expression hardened. "That's insubordination. Call it humanity." The lieutenant's glare could have frozen stone. "You're relieved of duty pending review. Report to the convoy tomorrow." Carter saluted, the gesture precise and empty, and walked out. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying fire, staring at his hands. Hands that had carried rifles, patched wounds, now condemned by the act of giving bread. When dawn bled over the horizon, he packed what little he had and walked back to the village one last time. Anna was in her garden, if it could be called that, a patch of earth barely large enough to hold weeds. When she saw him, she rose quickly. "What happened?" He smiled faintly. "Going home." "Good," she said, though her voice faltered. "You see family." He shook his head. "No. No family left." She understood then. Her eyes glistened, not with pity but with the recognition of shared loss. "Because of me?" she whispered. "No," he said, and stepped closer. "Because of the world." For a long moment they stood there, the quiet between them thick with everything unsaid. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper. His brother's photograph, worn and creased. He placed it in her hand. "He died in France," Carter said softly. "Good man. Looked like me. Maybe better." She held the photo gently, as if it might break. "I remember him," she said. "Through you." He smiled, then took her hand. A simple human gesture that carried all the weight of two ruined nations. "You'll be all right?" he asked. She nodded, though neither believed it. Behind them, an engine rumbled. The convoy assembling, soldiers calling out orders. Carter turned toward the sound, then back to her. "You still have me," he said quietly. "Even if I'm not here." Anna's lips parted, but no words came. He stepped back, gave one last look, then walked down the muddy road without turning around. The sound of the truck engine swallowed everything. Her breath, her grief, the fragile warmth of that impossible friendship. When the dust settled, she looked at the photograph in her hand. The man in the picture was smiling. Young, alive, unbroken. She pressed it to her chest, as if to keep his memory close to the heartbeat of another. That night, a knock echoed at her door. Harsh, impatient. She froze. Outside, two soldiers spoke in English, one of them younger, his voice uncertain. "Orders to search the premises," one said. Anna's fingers trembled around the photograph. She blew out the candle, plunged the room into darkness, and waited, her heart hammering as boots approached. The war was over, but mercy, she was learning, always came with a cost. The wind that moved through Fulda that summer carried a different kind of sound. Less of boots and gunfire, more of rebuilding, of hammers striking wood, of people learning how to breathe again. The Americans were leaving one by one, convoys rumbling down cracked roads that once echoed with tanks. Their banners faded, their orders sealed. The war had been over for months, but the silence it left behind was uneasy, like a wound that refused to close. Anna Muller lived quietly now. Her cottage, rebuilt from the bones of what was left, stood near the edge of a field where wildflowers were reclaiming the earth. The chapel still bore its scars, half roof, broken bell, but every morning she lit a candle there, not for God exactly, but for memory. On her windowsill lay a photograph. A young American soldier, smiling with another man who looked just like him. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, she had written one word, Danke. She hadn't seen Sergeant James Carter since the morning his convoy left. The sound of that truck fading down the valley still haunted her sleep. She'd watched it vanish into the mist until the road was empty, until the only thing left was the echo of his promise. You still have me. In the months that followed, she learned the cruel rhythm of waiting. Letters never came. News didn't reach her. But hope, foolish and persistent, remained. Each evening, when the air cooled and the sky bruised purple, she walked the same road he had taken. Sometimes she thought she saw his figure in the fog, broad shoulders, steady stride, but it was always smoke, always the past pretending to return. Yet she couldn't stop herself. Hope had become her last act of rebellion against despair. In town, the world was moving on. The Allied relief teams distributed food, rebuilt schools, and hired German civilians for reconstruction work. Anna joined them, teaching English to orphans in a small classroom where the roof leaked when it rained. The children adored her. They didn't know her past, didn't care about the war. They only knew she was kind and spoke softly when the thunder frightened them. Once, during a lesson, a boy asked her what peace meant. She paused, chalk in hand, staring at the word written on the board. She thought of the burned towns, the graves, the strangers who'd shown her mercy. Finally, she said, "Peace is when you stop hating the voice that speaks a different language." But at night, when the world went quiet, her heart betrayed her. She missed him, the man who had fed her when kindness was forbidden, who had risked his name for her hunger. Sometimes she imagined what he was doing now. Perhaps back in Ohio, tending to a farm, smiling at someone else across a dinner table. She wanted to believe that, to imagine him happy, even if the thought hollowed her from within. Then, one gray morning in late autumn, the sound of engines returned. She froze at her window, heart hammering as the convoy rolled past the village square. Trucks marked with red crosses, the insignia of the American Red Cross. Her pulse stumbled. She didn't want to hope, but her hands trembled anyway. That afternoon, as she carried supplies to the school, she saw him. At first, she thought the light was deceiving her. The way the sun slipped through the clouds and caught on his uniform. But no, it was him. His hair was shorter, his face leaner, older, but the way he carried himself, shoulders straight, gaze steady, was unchanged. Carter. He was unloading crates near the relief tent, speaking to an officer. When he turned and saw her standing there, time itself seemed to stutter. For a long moment they didn't move. The world went silent except for the whisper of the wind through the wheat. Then she dropped the bundle in her arms and took a step forward. He hesitated, as if uncertain whether he was dreaming too. Then he smiled, that same quiet smile that had once made her believe kindness could survive war, and everything that had been unsaid between them rushed into the space between. They met halfway. No words, just an embrace that felt like an exhale years in the making. He held her tightly, and she pressed her forehead against his shoulder, her tears soaking the fabric of his coat. For the first time, neither of them felt like the enemy. When they finally spoke, their voices trembled with disbelief. "You came back," she said in her halting English. "I told you I would," he answered softly. She pulled back slightly, searching his face for proof. "They not punish you?" He laughed, but the sound carried an edge of memory. "They tried, but the world's got too many broken things to fix now. They needed hands more than rules." They walked through the village together. Children followed, curious about the tall foreigner and the woman who smiled again. He told her of the months after his discharge, how he joined the Red Cross to stay close to Europe, to help rebuild what he once helped destroy. "I couldn't go back," he said quietly. "America felt too loud, too alive. I wasn't ready for that kind of peace." They stopped by the chapel, where the crucifix still leaned in its corner. Anna placed a candle on the step and lit it. The small flame flickered between them. "I kept your promise," she said softly. He frowned slightly. "My promise." She smiled faintly. "You said, I still have you." Carter looked at her then, truly looked. The war had carved lines around her eyes, but there was a light there. Something fierce, something alive. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You never lost me," he said. "Just took me a while to find the road back." They stayed by the chapel until dusk. The conversation moved between silences, words traded like careful gifts. He told her about his brother's grave in France. She told him about the children she taught. Somewhere in the middle, laughter returned, soft, fragile, the kind born from exhaustion and grace. When night fell, they walked to her cottage. He stopped at the gate, uncertain. "You sure it's all right?" She nodded. "This time, yes." Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls. She poured him water, offered bread. Simple things. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table, and for a brief moment, the world outside didn't exist. No nations, no orders, just the sound of breathing, of being alive together. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that cut through the warmth like a blade. Carter froze. Anna's eyes darted to the door. The voice outside was American, brisk, official. "Sergeant Carter? You're wanted at headquarters." He exhaled slowly. "They must have found out I was here." Her voice wavered. "They take you again?" He shook his head. "Maybe not. Maybe just questions." He stood, but she caught his hand. "You go, I wait." He hesitated, then pressed her hand to his chest. "Always," he said, then turned and opened the door. 2 soldiers stood outside, their faces unreadable in the dark. As he stepped out, one of them glanced at Anna and nodded politely, almost respectfully. Carter walked between them, his boots crunching against the frost. He didn't look back, but she saw his shoulders straighten, the same way they had the day he'd first marched into her life. The next morning, she went to the relief camp. But the tents were gone, the trucks already loaded. Panic clawed at her throat. She searched the faces of the workers, calling his name, but no one had seen him. One man said, "They moved east, new orders." Another shrugged, "Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Weeks later, she received a small envelope, stamped with an American seal. Inside was a single note, handwritten, the letters neat and deliberate. "Anna, some kindnesses live longer than the men who give them. If I don't return, know that you gave me peace when I thought none was left. James." Her hands shook as she read it, then pressed the paper to her lips. The wind rustled through the open window, carrying the sound of distant church bells. She closed her eyes, whispering into the quiet, "You still have me." Outside, the children were laughing, chasing each other through the tall grass, their voices carrying into the blue horizon. The world, at last, was learning how to live again. And though no one saw her, the candle in the chapel burned brighter that night, its small, unwavering flame a final echo of peace.